I think we might make it start because there's lots and lots of content to today's seminar, and I'm sure we want to get to it. So it's great to be chairing this session. I'm Paul Ashwin, head of Department for Educational Research, and I really see today as a great celebration, a celebration of the launch of a new online open access journal in the department, Studies in Technology Enhanced Learning. It's incredibly exciting, and the kind of inaugural issue is full of really exciting and dynamic ideas. So it's great to be chairing this. I'm just going to say a few words about the journal before I then hand over to Kyungmee and Brett, who are going to kind of lead the session, talk us through, and then we've got a number of contributors to the journal who are going to talk about aspects of their paper. The journal is focused on developing a critically integrated, self-aware, connected conversation about technology enhanced learning. So it's really trying to think about technology enhanced learning in a number of ways, drawing on a number of perspectives and standing back and thinking about where the field lies. And that's incredibly exciting. Also, what I really like about the way the journal's set up is a real encouragement for different kinds of contributions. So kind of more traditional scholarly papers, more polemic papers, and also, as we see in the inaugural issue, kind of commentaries on the papers. So really structured to set up an ongoing conversation around different aspects of technology enhanced learning. The first issue is focused on debating the status of theory in technology enhanced learning. And, it's chock full of stuff. So we have two editorials, one for the journal as a whole, a kind of introduction to the journal as a whole, and one an introduction to the special issue, 11 papers and 5 commentaries. And they really do span an exciting range of areas related to technology enhanced learning. So in relation to theories, we have discussion of Foucault, activity theory, phenomenography, approaches to research, including design-based research. In terms of the concepts, there's discussions of infrastructure, there's an exploration of simulation-based learning in technology-enhanced learning. And there's also 2 papers that are really interesting that look at the role of teachers in different ways. One which examines the role of teachers in introducing technology-enhanced learning, and another that looks at how teachers use literature about TEL to situate what they're doing. And then we also have debates around the position of theory in TEL, and also a discussion about, in relation to PhD's thesis, how do you make an original contribution to knowledge, and how does that relate to theory? So as you can see, a really exciting range of topics. And on a number of those papers, as I've said, there are kind of commentaries that explore the issues further and pick them up. So the structure of today will be, Brett's going to give us an overview about the idea behind the journal, and then Kyungmee is going to introduce the special issue, and then we're going to have brief overviews of some of the papers that Brett and Kyungmee will introduce, and then Brett will talk about, at the end, where the journal is going in the future, and then we'll open it up for questions. As I've said, it probably works most effectively if you put your questions in the chat, and then I'll call on you to answer. If you just want your question to be in the chat and you don't want to ask it in person, then just let me know, and we'll take it from there. So the final thing for me before I hand over to Brett is just to remind people, if you're not speaking, please turn off your camera and mute your microphone. And now I'm going to do those 2 things and hand over to Brett. So over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Paul. I'll now attempt to share my screen, which I'm hoping you can all see now, my slides. So as Paul said, the journal is chock full, a term I like, and it's also the product of a very long period of gestation. I've tried, and I remember trying to cover some of that content when contributing to the introductory editorial. So I won't attempt to cover all of that ground here in this first part of this seminar. What I'm going to do instead is focus in on the core ideas that we're trying to promote through the journal. And everything I say in this first section is probably covered in some more detail in that first introductory editorial. So in this first section, I'll be covering the idea behind the journal. And to do so, we have to have, I think, a few reflective conversations that can be a bit uncomfortable about a field in which a lot of us have put a lot of work over a lot of time and have invested a lot of our identity in. I think there's a lot of happiness within the field that it appears to be growing, and it appears to be increasingly viewed as urgent by an increasing number of people. Now, of course, the COVID pandemic has made people interested in technology enhanced learning who might not have been before, but that's kind of, I think, speeding up a trajectory that was already evident, rather than changing things in a fundamental, way of changing the direction. So we're happy with that. There are more people interested, there's more research being produced, people seem to be viewing it as important. So I've talked about this in terms of an explosion of venues and papers. There are now so many journals that it's difficult to keep a track. And even many established journals are producing vast quantities of papers. Some of them have upped their publication schedules by a factor of 10 over the past decade or so. And now there's a couple of journals, everyone will probably know which they are, but one of them is prominently Computers and Education, which is now doing a volume per month. So it does pose the question then of why you would, in that context, choose to launch another journal. And the reality is that you would try and do that, but if you think you can offer something a bit different. So let's think about what it is that we want to offer that's a bit different. I think we have to start by thinking about the essence of the knowledge that's actually produced in TEL. And here the picture is a little bit less positive. So there's a lot of stuff going on, perhaps more than it's easy to keep abreast of. But if you look at people who examine the papers of TEL, who do content analysis of the papers, it's fairly routine to find the kind of conclusions that are on the slide that I've quoted from Gunn and Steele's paper. Poorly applied methodologies, limited reference to theory, weak results, uneven presentation of data, and overblown and unsupported claims of impact and importance. Now, of course, much of the rest of this presentation is going to be talking about the theory issue, so I'm glad that they referenced that as a problem. I think for present purposes, I'll just dwell for a moment on the overblown and unsupported claims of impact and importance. And there's also a much larger and wider critical strand of thinking about TEL, which is saying it's not a very critical field. We need to be more critical. And a very prominent voice saying things like that is Neil Selwyn, who says we need to start viewing TEL as a social science rather more than a science. And actually, those two things appear to be a little bit at odds with each other. So what kind of science is actually having poorly applied methodologies and uneven presentation of data and overblown and unsupported claims of impact and importance? What kind of science does that? Not a very scientific science, actually. So how are these things to be reconciled? Now, here I think we need to be prepared to be a little bit angular and controversial. And I think the common thread is what I've called tailism, which is a phrase often used in political science, probably much more than technology enhanced learning, but it basically means we see something else as much more important than us, and we try and attach ourselves to it. And so I don't mean tail as in terms of providing balance, like actually that's a good thing that a tail might do for a dog, but actually just wagging enthusiastically like this at everything that comes along, every new technology. When the policymakers say there's a problem, we can solve it. So we're serving something from outside ourselves. And the reason for saying that we're a science and for thinking of ourselves in that way is actually to say we have to try and give ourselves gravitas, to try and say we're serious people, we can provide the solutions. The policymakers can say the evidence says so and so, usually in support of whatever they want. And so I think this is how the TEL field has seen itself, as serving other people. And there is, of course, a truth to that. We do serve other people. We're not just doing this as a purely self-interested exercise, but you have to, I think, recognize sometimes that it's useful to step back and think, well, how are we serving people, and do we need to do that in a less immediate way? So some people, the prominent voice here again would be somebody like Neil Selwyn, have talked about the need to be critical about technology. They talk about the field as being a positive project of technology enthusiasm and evangelism. I think that's reasonable, but I think what we also need to do, perhaps, especially given that this critical strand of thinking about technology has been evident for a while and hasn't had that much impact, is actually to start being critical about ourselves. And that's the basis of saying I think we should have a scholarly conversation among ourselves about the field, and to not feel guilty about focusing sometimes on the scholarly field of technology enhanced learning. So I've summarized what we say in the introductory editorial by focusing in here on the three facets of what such a scholarly conversation might look like. And actually they are, as Paul mentioned them in his introduction. So I'll try and give them a bit of content and flesh. So the first is that we're trying to promote a scholarly conversation that's critically integrated. So in the introductory editorial, we say that this is a vision wherein critical thinking becomes more closely entwined with the standard scholarly practices of the field. And what we often find is that's not the case. There's a few kind of very well informed and very good but elite scholars who offer critical commentary on TEL in a way that I think a lot of people find quite intimidating, and a lot of other people who just get on with the business of doing empirical research and find themselves constrained to make certain kinds of reports. And at our centre seminars, we find that kind of thing acknowledged a lot, where people are saying what I couldn't put in the journal article that I was thinking behind the scenes. And it's reinforced within the publishing ecosystem. Some journals are heavily empirical and others are saying we're not standard edtech journal, which is actually taken from the aims and scope of learning, media and technology. So we want it to be seen that everyone should be reflecting critically on their own work, even if they view themselves as empirical researchers or techie people or whatever, that they should be empowered to think about how their work can be a source of reflection for them and others on an ongoing basis. The second of the three facets of conversation is that we want to be more self-aware. We want the conversation to be self-aware. It alludes to something I was talking about earlier, that we look at ourselves. We focus on the field as much as on what we're serving. So we say it in the editorial as a desire for scholars in the field to regard research and scholarship as a legitimate object of inquiry in itself. And that has not been the case. And actually, it's not just a fact of omission. We haven't forgotten to do that. As is mentioned in the issue, there's a lot of normative negativity about that. It is seen as being self-indulgent. It's seen as not serving society or our stakeholders, or not doing something urgent. And I think we have to get away from that guilt. And I think we have to navigate between two problems. The Scylla, I don't know if you know the Scylla and Charybdis metaphor, is you have to navigate between these clashing rocks in Greek mythology. If you go too close to either of them, you will smash your boat. So there's a kind of unswerving technological positivity that's not very specific. It's always just kind of technology is good, or we're responding to immediate problems that somebody's got and not thinking and stepping back and seeing the bigger picture. And I think we have to navigate between those two things. And we might do that by encouraging scholars to reflect on their own work, to reflect on how that contributes to wider agendas, and how their work can actually realistically influence policy and practice. It might be that they see their work as providing one part of something that someone else might take on further down the line to influence policy and practice, rather than seeing themselves as an immediate servant of that agenda. And the third and final of these facets is a connected scholarly conversation. I think one problem in the TEL field might actually surprise people who haven't engaged with it very much, which is we don't tend to engage with each other's work in a very close way. It has even been the case in the past that in-depth and critical literature reviews in empirical papers were explicitly discouraged. And in fact, I still see that. It's still explicitly stated in the aims and scope of computers and education, for example, which in other fields certainly would be considered unusual. So we want to get past that and say we want to encourage scholars to reflect on how they've engaged with the ideas of others, how those ideas have influenced them, and how they disagree or offer different perspectives from those. So we've formulated a connected scholarly conversation as a desire for scholarship in which researchers directly and explicitly engage with the arguments of their peers. So we're not seeing the rest of the field as a set of fixed results from which we might vary just slightly. It's like, I think I'm going to research a slightly newer technology, I get slightly different results, and then I say, well, probably the reason for those underlying differences is I was researching a slightly different technology. Where we never do is criticize the existing results as something that were themselves a product of academic argumentation. So we want scholars to think about those issues and to enable that to happen. And before I hand over to Kyungmee, who's going to cover the first issue, it would be worth saying that our vision for the journal is to host that scholarly conversation. We want a platform that's open access, partly because, of course, we want to be inclusive of people who don't have access to institutional means of accessing journals. But it's partly about having the freedom to set our own agenda and not be constrained by what a publisher or funder might want. So this is a completely self-generating project with no outside support. And I think that's perfectly okay. It's not particularly a moan or a limitation at this point. We want to emphasize special issues so that we can all talk about the same thing. And we're going to be talking a lot about the first special issue today, of course. And we want to encourage commentaries on earlier works, both in previous issues and in terms of encouraging, if they wish, peer reviewers of papers to reflect on the final paper as it was accepted and to say how they engage with the ideas in the process of peer review. So those are our core ideas for the journal, I suppose. And with that said, it might be worth looking at how we've tried to make that work in the first issue on theory.
Cool. Right, next slide, please. All right, so as Brett set out the entire agenda for the journal, I'm just going to talk about the special issue, which is the first issue that, as introduced by Paul, 11 authors contributed, and then 5 commentaries were embedded in. So the question that we want to grab at the beginning of the launch of the journal is whether really a TEL scholarship is atheoretical or not. Because as set out by Brett, there has been a lot of criticism entirely coming to the field saying that we haven't been theoretical. And then we ourselves often call us that we are very practice-oriented, evidence-based, and data-driven and multidisciplinary. However, what happened actually is that when we try to submit the journal article to one of the journals, if you don't have theoretical framework section, actually it's often come back to you and it's not going to be accepted. And when our PhD students wrote a dissertation entirely about TEL and not having the section or not having the chapter about theory, we're not very sure whether it's going to go through it all right. So it means that we really have theory in our work. And then even so, why we have to be criticized for the past decades that we're not theoretical. So often, if you look at how theory has been used in the field. Theories are always there, whether it's theory about technology and theory about learning and teaching. And we often have theory of adult learners, distance learners. So we talk about learners and teachers. And we also have theories that we borrow from other fields like sociology and geography, philosophy. So there is always section that we have theory, and theories has been used in the field. But going back to the questions, and then how come TEL is a theoretical then? Right, next slide. And then another question that we try to answer by inviting people to contribute with their different voices is, if then TEL needs theories, or what kind of theory TEL need, and in which sense theory should be needed. So of course the answer, at least within the center, which we contribute, we dedicate to this kind of intellectual discussion among center members, that we talk a lot about what we can do about theoretical work. And then we are clear that we're dealing with issues which are as complex as other fields are dealing with. So if you think about role of technology in educational practice, or even beyond educational practice, it's a very complex thing. You can't really grasp what's happening with different technology in a classroom without having some theoretical underpinning. At the same time, if you want to make some changes, often we do, whether it's a change for other people or ourselves. TEL research and TEL projects are aimed to make some changes in educational practice and students' life and teachers' life, and it's very complex. And then to make those changes applicable, actually we need to have some fundamental understanding of how changes are made. And also, if TEL practice, if you look at it, is situated in very complex setting. It's very complex institutional conditions influencing TEL practice. And then also within bigger society, TEL practice are ever increasing its complexity. So of course, the answer immediately is that we need theory. So the two things together. So we've been using theories. We've been always writing about different theory. And then we know that we need theory. No one is going to argue back about it. And then how those two together, we are still criticized that we're not theoretical. So that's the things that we've been dealing with. We've been trying to grasp what is the reason for that. And that's how Special Issue came out from the beginning. So next slide. Please, Brett. So in our call for papers, we asked these 5 questions to our prospect authors. So in this special issue, we wanted to talk about, at least partially answer, of course it's not, although it's 280 page, but of course answering those 5 questions fully is not really possible task. So we asked those 5 questions to the author to think about when they write their contribution. So how can theory help us think differently about TEL? And to which extent the research in field is theoretical or atheoretical in our view? And what kind of theory might influence our scholarship in a much better way or more critical way? And how can we do that? And how the theory come to gain and lose its power within the field? Because there are particularly popular theories that almost everyone seems to using it. And how those theories became really popular in the field. And how important is theory, a different type of theory for contributing to our objectives. And here we set it clearly that there are different types of theories. So if you think about one theory in your head, I may think about different theory in my head. And theory has different layer or level of complexity within it. So when we say theory, it's also important that we make it clear and that we make our theoretical discussion explicit enough for us to be able to communicate with our colleagues in the field. So that has been those also are 5 questions had been placed in our call for papers. And then what happened is, right? So here we are. So we had 11 papers and it's all very diverse and different. Everyone brought very important and interesting points from very different places. So at the end of the day, for 11 paper, we tried to group them. And there are 4 different threads that we find from those authors' contribution. So first set of papers are dealing with particular theory they think that really TEL should engage more with. And these authors, including myself, find particular theory very helpful and useful to understand the TEL practice and the phenomenon they are dealing with. And they try to explain how we can use this theory, and using this particular theory, how it will enhance the quality of our work and how it will make us more critical about certain thing. And the next thread is, so here we have two. So people can, so two of the contributors, including Dawn and Brad, have talked about what the theory is, and then relationship between theory and research. So in different research projects, all called TEL, how research has been, how theory has been positioned in different research projects and different research articles, and how we can understand theory and similar constructs like theory can be, how can we use those more usefully? And then also there are two authors talk about how theory is its relationship with either pedagogical method or research method. So as you can see, two papers here. One paper talk about how theory can be used alongside a DBR, which is design-based research, which is one methodological approach that many TEL study have used. And then another paper here is talking about how theory can be positioned and be usefully used by the practitioner when they're using simulation-based teaching and learning. And then next slide. And then there are other groups of people who talk about how theory has been used by practitioners and how theory has been in the way that, like, it's more than theory itself, but the way that the theory has been used by TEL research prevent or enable those particular subjects in the educational scene from being able to do and imagine different possibility, or not be able to do different things that they want to do. So these are four kind of groups that when we try to group it, so for just helping our readers when they try to read the entire volume, hopefully, can go through it and have certain point of references and structured view that they can start from one place to others. And the last slide is that we have great commentaries. And I find this is, as an author who contributed to journal, I find that having this commentary, and I have to say thank you, Mac, for your beautifully written commentary on my paper. I find this very, very satisfying. So the feeling that we know that some of our paper, when you published, is cited. So you got the, those alarms or notification from ResearchGate that your paper has been cited by so-and-so. But like, if you look at it, actually, it's very difficult to know how those authors cited my paper, or because they don't give much comment. But it's really nice to read from the reviewer that how she read my paper and how she agree or disagree with different part of my paper. And it's feeling really quite nice. So we have 5 commentaries. And as you can see, Phil reviewed 3 papers for the issue. Thanks again, Phil. Has their own review. And this is the practice we really want the journal to continue. So I'll just leave it in terms of introducing the special issue. So if you go back to the editorial for the special issue, you can read a bit more about the issue, and then I hope that you can enjoy reading actual papers. So from now on, I will talk about, we can briefly, all those 9 authors will talk about our paper. So it's again me. So my first paper, Michel Foucault and Technology and Learning, and an analytic review of 10 Foucauldian studies on particularly online learning and teaching. So Brett, can you go next slide? All right, so there should be one more slide that okay, it's not there, but that's fine. So, okay, I'm going to talk about this for 2 minutes. So what happened is that I've been engaged. I mean, I learn about Foucault and I use it kind of massively for my dissertation. And I always find it really interesting and useful to understand my own research agenda differently. So in this paper, the aim was to introduce Foucault's idea, which is seemingly quite complex, and then people can find it quite difficult to grasp. So I want to introduce, using very conversational way of speaking, I want to introduce this Foucault's useful concept to the TEL researchers, especially thinking of talking to my doctoral researchers who may benefit a lot from using Foucault. And so that's first part of the paper. And then I analyzed 10 different papers. It's funny that I tried to do systematic literature review. And then I realized when it comes to very specific online distance education setting and higher education level, there are only 15 papers showed up. So I didn't have to, I mean, I couldn't really do much of systematic review. I didn't have to go through a lot of crazy inclusion and exclusion criteria. So those 10 papers, I tried to critically analyze and show the reader that how those 10 papers use Foucault's idea very differently from each other. And then the finding they draw out of using Foucault, how those findings are quite new or quite different from more, commonly appeared research papers on online education. So there are three kind of reasons. Conclusion was that there are 3 ways that Foucault's idea can benefit TEL scholarship. So first of all, it's really about to break the taken for granted assumptions. So if you have very clearly set idea about teacher and what the best teacher look like or what the best way of learning is, so Foucault's ideas really help us to break that taken for grantedness of a certain assumption and free us from thinking in a way that everyone has been thinking for years. So that makes us be able to critical, but in very structured way. And secondly, that it's helpful in a way that we can see the big picture. So at the end of it, what Foucault really tried to engage with is power relationship within the different social institutions. So our practice are institutionally grounded, isn't it? So if using some of the Foucault's idea to look at different subjects to engage with the TEL practice, it's actually very helpful for us to have the big picture outside our classroom or even school. And third one, which I can't remember right now, I tried to remember, but anyway, there was another point that, one more point that Foucault's idea could be very helpful. So I finished my paper with, so the Foucault's idea really helped us to understand the historical development of particular theory that we've been using, and then understanding how weak the theoretical ground or underpinning of certain theory that we are using itself really help us to be able to be more critical and think about different things in different way. So I concluded the paper, and the last sentence, which I will read here, is that despite its usefulness, Foucault's name cannot be a simple add-on ornament in our work. It is very heavy name, better not to be used or better not to hang up on a weak hook. So what I've tried to really say is that Foucault's ideas very useful if we have certain research questions we want to answer. But other than that, it's maybe better not to use it. All right, that's me. So shall we move to Mac?
Great. Thanks, Kyungmee. I'm assuming I can be seen at the moment. Okay, there we go. Great, thank you. I'm just going to give a brief commentary on my article, which is entitled Infrastructure and Technology Enhanced Learning, Context, Agency, Multiplicity. So next slide, please. I'm a librarian at the University of Cambridge, and the motivation for my research stemmed from a sense that traditional ways of framing librarians' work in terms of collecting and curating resources needed updating, given new ways that librarians currently support learning and research in higher education these days. And I was particularly interested in exploring whether and how librarians might be contributing to knowledge production in the university, especially via social media. And next slide, please. So I was drawn to infrastructural theory because of its emphasis on the mundane decisions that people make when creating and maintaining infrastructure and the associated social effects of such practices on knowledge production. So this focus on librarians' lived experiences with technology and the mutually constitutive ways librarians shape infrastructure and that infrastructure in turn shapes professional work was very, very useful for me as a framework to describe my participants' use of social media. All right, next slide, please. So the core messages of my article is that infrastructure, though generally either ignored in the TEL literature or treated as mute background systems, is actually a contingent and relatively fragile affair, constituted not only of individuals' practices, but exerting significant influence on its practitioners. Infrastructure, therefore, is not separate from or in opposition to teaching and learning. And moreover, and most importantly, seen through the framework of infrastructural theory, seemingly unassailable systems, as it's often portrayed in the TEL literature, such as learning analytics or MOOCs, might not be as monolithic or permanent as we might grant. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of implications for TEL, I hope my study raises awareness of the complexity of support systems that are invisible or seem to just work quietly in the background. My research suggests the benefits of exploring the values woven into infrastructure to understand how such systems influence educators' work and how educators in turn can shape infrastructure. And finally, I think that infrastructure is a hugely underexplored topic in TEL. And I think a really thorough literature review of conceptualizations of infrastructure in TEL is in order, which is research that in the future I'd like to take forward. So that's the end of my 2 minutes.
Hi everyone. So I'm now going to bring in Don, who was going to be delayed at another event. So Don has very kindly shared a short video of his paper, which I'm going to attempt to share now.
The title of my paper is Theories, Theoretical and Conceptual Frameworks, Models and Constructs, Limiting Research Outcomes Through Misconceptions and Misunderstandings. When I've supervised postgraduate students undertaking research studies, I've found that they often question how to think about, identify and use conceptual or theoretical frameworks to underpin their studies. This, for me, was the real motivation for the paper, to consider the challenge that postgraduate students face in identifying conceptual or theoretical frameworks, how to break down and consider the challenge, and to exemplify how some students have successfully achieved this and avoided possible pitfalls. The core issue that this paper addresses is the need to think about conceptual or theoretical frameworks, not as a simple off-the-shelf choice, but to think through the elements of a study and how these elements are underpinned and related through one or more models, frameworks, concepts, or theories. The core message of the paper is that if conceptual or theoretical underpinnings are used in a subservient way, then this has the potential to limit a study's outcomes and contributions. Models, frameworks, concepts, and theories are not set in stone. They should always be questioned and considered in context. They all need to be developed over time to match contemporary situations. Certainly, this paper should not be seen as an endpoint. The focus of this work can be taken further, aligned with critical questioning about the definition and aims of TEL itself. Given the ways that TEL has been adopted and has advanced over the past years, there is clearly much that can be done to explore appropriation and development of conceptual and theoretical underpinnings in considerably more detail.
Okay, hi everyone again. I hope you were able to see that okay, and should now be looking at the slide and seeing me again. So my paper's next, and it's called Theory, Disputes and the Development of the Technology Enhanced Learning Research Field. And it's really motivated by a desire to map the arguments occurring about theory in the TEL scholarship, partly because I couldn't find that anyone had done that. And actually, I was originally seeking to write a different paper for this special issue that would build on some of those debates, and then figured out that I couldn't find a good summary of what those debates really were. So I thought I should produce one. So it's important to say what I was looking at and what I wasn't. I wasn't looking at how theory is used in empirical work, which I have done in other papers before. What I was looking at is how is theory discussed and debated in that kind of critical strand of scholarship that I was talking about at the outset of this seminar. So there is a critical strand of scholarship which says that TEL lacks a certain je ne sais quoi, that it has a certain set of problems, that we need to move forward in certain ways. It's a minority of the field, of course, but it is quite a visible one and an increasingly visible one. So I looked at papers that were critical commentaries on the field and which discussed theory. Now, in mapping an argument, I was inspired by the work of Richard Andrews, who says that we do this in 3 stages. We scope the territory of the dispute, what is taken to be at stake, and what does everybody agree on as the reasons for having this argument. We map out the points of dispute, what are the core areas where there is some sort of argument, and then we map out the positions that people take in relation to those points of dispute. I'm only going to talk about the first 2 of those now, although the others are in the paper. The territory is surprisingly congruent with the things I said at the start of this seminar. So TEL has a history and sense of pride as an applied field, and so being theoretical is viewed with suspicion. If you're too theoretical, you're not being applied enough. But it's interesting that in some of the papers, they were drawing on things like surveys of researchers and things like that, and find that actually theory is viewed more positively by people in non-promoted positions. I'm thinking they mean early career researchers and things like that. But there is a desire to become a more scholarly endeavor. And of course, this is a desire expressed by the people writing this kind of paper. So how widely that's shared, my current work can't say. So if I map out the points of dispute, you'll notice that the lots of things around the edges of this slide, they are all the stances, and I won't cover all of those now, but I'll just talk about the 4 areas. So the first area that I found people arguing about was what I've called canon disputes. And this is the fact that we have a historical set of theories that people talk about as the real theories, bona fide theories, you'll hear people or read people saying in the literature, these are the things that the field has always accepted as theories. And we know, we all automatically know where this is going to go. This is behaviorism moving through to cognitivism, moving through to constructivism, moving through to social constructivism, those kind of theories. And there's a lot of debate about those kind of theories. Are they in fact theories, or are they something else? What should we do with those categories? Are they holding us back? Are people really paying attention to them? And those kind of things. But that's part of this debate. The second part, which is the red circle, is the functions of theory and research. And there's a lot of talking here about how people only seem to recognize a few functions, and that there are some things like actually enabling us to frame the study in the first place, for example, that is often used but is not discussed. It's kind of a bit tacit. But there are increasingly different arguments about functions of theory in TEL. The fact is that theories have different functions and they look like different things. And here I actually draw on Don's work about the distinction between theories and conceptual frameworks and so on. And the choice of theory affects their function as well. So using certain theories might help us to be more relevant to stakeholders and to be seen to be so, while others are seen as more challenging to stakeholders. And of course, that does relate to what we perceive the field to be. The third area of dispute relates to what I've called interchange, and it relates to this very complicated thing that there, as Kyungmee mentioned, there's a lot of theory talked about in the TEL field, and there's a lot of talk about how the field is atheoretical. And how does that, I mean, isn't that a contradiction? Isn't that meaningless? Doesn't one negate the other? And the fact is, it's not true, at least according to the authors whose work I mapped. The fact is that theoretical and empirical discourses in the field are seen as almost occurring in parallel and not really influencing each other. There are just these different spheres going on and not much interchange between them. And there's a lot of talk about why that is. Some of it's about blaming researchers and saying we have structural disincentives. And some of it's about saying, well, the theories we actually have to hand are not very useful for what people want to use for empirical research. And there's a lot of talk about how to ameliorate that situation. And the fourth area I map is about what I've called exceptionalism. And this is about really whether we see TEL as something unique. And there is a surprisingly strong body of work in TEL that does position TEL as unique and say we need our own theories. We need to develop our own things. The actual research objects that we're trying to study are unique, and various reasons are offered for that. So we should develop our own theories, and various theories are offered for that. And there are other people saying, well, actually, we need to be more strongly associated with interdisciplinary discourse. What does that mean? And debating that kind of thing. And I see these as kind of paired. The debate about interchange and saying, well, we don't actually use theory to influence our work very much, is of course related to the debates about functions and what the functions of theory could and should be. And the debate about exceptionalism and the identity of the TEL field, I think, is really about saying we have kind of said for a long time that we are deriving all of our theoretical inspiration from Western academic cognitive psychology or something like that. What that's resulted in is most people deciding that they're not theoretical. And so can we align ourselves differently? And there are different ways of saying that. We could invent our own theories, or we could be more aligned with sociology, or we could do something else as well. But the key point is what we're really debating there is, where does the TEL field sit in academia, especially since, if you look around the world, people researching TEL are in completely different academic departments. So we're currently sitting as the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning in an educational research department, but many TEL related people are not sitting in educational research departments or anything of the kind. And so there is a debate about the disciplinary position of TEL. And those are the things that I've kind of taken out. Do we want to be unique? Are we really on the verge of a rupture in the field? People always say, oh, we're always on the verge of some massive change. And then it turns out, in retrospect, we seem to have been on that verge for decades. That happens with technology, of course, as well. But these theories, these debates, some of them are in papers that are not that recent. And it always seems we're on that verge. And what does it mean to say that the early career researchers or the non-promoted researchers are the most enthusiastic about theory? Does this mean that as they get more promoted and as they get older, they'll get wiser and realize they need to be more pragmatic? Or does this signal a generational shift in the field? And at the moment, I think it's too early to tell from the literature where that's going to go. So those are the kind of disputes that I mapped and where I see them having implications for the development of the field. Okay, James.
Hi there. Thanks, Brett. Hopefully my audio is at the right sort of level. I found some inconsistencies between Zoom and Teams earlier, which hopefully won't be a problem. Okay, so in terms of the paper here, we very nearly managed to get McDowell J and McDowell J, and the perfect ambiguity that would have gone with that. So I'll first of all just confirm the suspicions that the surname is actually identical by marriage rather than coincidence. And I, of course, worked with my wife on this paper. In terms of the motivations for it, well, both studies that are alluded to here were in fact our PhDs, which we completed in Res. Julia's was through the traditional routes, working away from campus. My own was through the TEL doctoral programme, and I was one of the earlier guinea pigs from cohort 2. Now, in terms of motivations for producing the paper, I'm not actually going to say much about theory here, in that I can already see that there was this connection between theory and method, which was highlighted by Kyungmee earlier. And we'll start to sort of mention more on the method in a moment. I mean, really, the motivations were numerous. One in particular, I think, was this opportunity there to sort of both of us to reflect on how we had used the methodologies we'd used, how we'd gone about sort of using the DBR approach, bringing in really an entire basket full of theory in different ways, using it to inform the initial design of interventions, how to then sort of inform the iterative development of those interventions, bringing in new theory. And there was a lot of flexibility there, which really sort of tied in with the methodological approach. And I suppose I also found that I've got sort of professional and I suppose pedagogic motivations as well in terms of wanting to put a paper in. Very pragmatically, I wanted to support the team's work in setting up the journal in the first place, because I think this offers wonderful opportunity really for PGRs at Res to start developing some of their sort of early pieces of work, which perhaps been submitted as part of doctoral programs, to generate that early publication record. And I know from experience on the TEL program that some of us were perhaps a little sort of reticent to jump in at that deep end, feeling that perhaps we needed to complete the doctorate beforehand. I think this is a great opportunity to immerse people in that early. I suppose to that end, I was also wanting to kind of give something back to the TEL program. And I've received numerous requests for copies of my thesis from later members of the TEL program. And this kind of, again, provides an opportunity to give something back by making some of the core messages available in a form that could be cited. And it was also useful for those who are looking at using design-based research to sort of explore issues in messy conditions, which I thought was sort of a very key part of it. So in terms of what the paper is really about, well, I suppose it's about underlining that that importance of the relationship between theory and practice in TEL research, again, especially in those sort of messy conditions. For me, those messy conditions were sort of university classroom, university laboratories. For Julia, those messy conditions were quite literally outdoor settings. Some of them were very messy. Now, also aim to provide two sort of quite contrasting examples, really, of how a design-based approach can be adopted and adapted to sort of form an underlying research methodology. Julia's approach sort of had quite a broad sort of input of theoretical sort of positions to sort of build a framework. Mine tended to be positioned between perhaps two sort of competing schools of thought. And I think the flexibility around the methodology enabled us to sort of bring in things in different shapes and create these sort of different shapes of what we were doing. Now, I suppose what I'm hoping is that by having done this, we've demonstrated that there's an opportunity there to use this sort of research methodology for a doctoral thesis. And I do remember looking at one paper which was questioning whether or not DBR was in fact appropriate for a doctoral thesis. I think we've also perhaps started to address some of those concerns from perhaps one side of the paradigmatic divide, which kind of suggests that anything less than the gold standard of the scientific model somehow lacks value. And again, the detail of that was perhaps sort of within the paper and perhaps within the theses themselves more than anything I'll say here. But I hope we've also sort of conveyed a sense of what can be achieved by adopting a kind of a mixed methods mindset, really, when approaching problems in TEL. Not that it's necessary to sort of bring in data from a range of different areas, but to think of it in the mindset sense of what can be possible. So the core message, really, that theory plays a fundamental role in TEL research. and that in conjunction with that flexibility to take an emergent approach to research design, this sort of theory practice nexus, if you like, within DBR, I suppose it brings theory to life, is that core message. How do I see it being taken forward in the future? I suppose it was 10 years ago when I first started looking at DBR, and at the time it was not at all uncommon to hear DBR described as a fledgling methodology. Now things have moved on in that time. It's now what, sort of 30 years since this emerged. But I would hope that this work starts to sort of perhaps empower some of those looking to conduct research into practice, and to evaluate interventions in these messy settings, and to do so with sort of greater confidence. Certainly perhaps those who were in the earlier stages of the TEL program, who are still looking at what they want to do for their major piece of work. And again, I'd be quite happy to talk more on the TEL program if needs be. I'm sure I must have used my 2 minutes there, so I'll probably better stop.
Hello, let me start to introduce our research, which me and my supervisor work together. And the initial motivation of this research has started from our online discussion group organized by our stuff. And then so we had decided to discuss an article written by Lynn Vandler, and in the article the author points out that theory has been doing, most of which the previous speakers, Brad and my supervisor and the other speakers all mentioned, and which including lurking, distilling, and reframing. Briefly, like to introduce a bit, that theory has been there, and theory has been clearing all the complexity in the data, and it reframes the educational phenomenon that we see. And also, and the author proposes that theory in general could be generating new ideas and exceeding what we have been taken for granted, and it can vibrate, meaning like it can connect the things that have been understood as the separate things. And so we were quite curious then what theories in TEL research has been doing and have been doing. So, and next, what is the paper really about? So it is about how theories in teacher education is constructed. So we wanted to see how theories in TEL research have been constructed, especially in relation to teacher education, and how these theories shape TEL research. So we conducted systematic literature review, and we analyzed a set of articles and closely read text, and we found some interesting trends. And it leads me to the third question. What is then core message? The message is that theories in TEL research has been building its legitimacy. We as a researcher, we draw on famous or popular research as by putting some comment, or by noting the sources of the research. And let me move on to the next action that theory has been doing, that theories have been medicalizing educational phenomenon. That it means theories in that specific area tend to position teachers and educators as those people who lack a certain competences. And to cure that ill practices, they were prescribing certain new teacher trainings. And that's what I meant. That's what we meant by medicalizing education phenomenon. And then the next one is it expands the territory of theory. So it suggests the next research by converting quantitative research into qualitative research, and vice versa. So the next core message is that we better be careful when you decide what to choose as the main theory of the research. And we also claim that we need to generate new theory that can exceed the dominant use of theory that could limit our thinking and imagination. So how this research can be taken forward? So we urge researchers to imagine what theory can do in different ways. So by avoiding the imposed responsibility on us as a researcher and educators that we need to do something very well, or we should not do this for a certain objective, and we can do this also by not conceptualizing theory as a tool for governance, right? Since this is the national agenda or the era, the test that this era is imposing on us, so we need to do this. So we probably want to avoid those imposed responsibility. And lastly, so by not rendering theory as a measurement tool and following diagnosis and prescriptions for teacher trainings. And that's all for me. And thank you very much.
Hello. Thanks, Brett and Kyungmee, for getting us to this point. You deserve to be very proud, and I sincerely thank you. This contribution is set at the UK's Royal School of Military Engineering, and it examines the experiences of 10 engineering academics interacting with theory and TEL. That's interacting with theory as discrete from a particular theory, and by academics, I mean practitioners, really. The teaching focus lecturers, a distinction which is likely to matter, isn't it? The impetus for it was a fairly widespread and yet unexamined belief that engineering academics tend to interact with theory and TEL quite differently than how they interact with theory in the application of engineering. So, for example, in the field of hydrogeology, if engineers want to identify a viable groundwater source in the desert, we'll do a lot of theoretical engineering analysis rather than just run around drilling 200-meter deep holes everywhere until we strike water. And yet, that's not a bad analogy for the way some engineering academics, at least superficially, claim to approach theory and TEL. While they'll openly discuss how theory and engineering practice helps them to record, predict, inform, model, all that great stuff, when it comes to theory and TEL, it's framed as less consequential for work and learning, if indeed it's framed at all. So really, I wanted to get to the bottom of what these academic practitioners, teaching focused lecturers really experienced and perceived about theory and TEL. And there is a but. When we deliberately scratch the surface with them, we actually find that theory and TEL is antagonistic. It informs quite intellectual analysis, and it's wielded in some quite emotive interactions, some of which you'll read for yourselves. And on that note, apologies in advance for some of the language in that paper, but it is quite important for the feelings behind them. So theory and TEL is disputed and contested. It's leveraged in problematic debates about resourcing and staffing and quality and the need for change. And when those dilemmas are aggravated, if we take the time and opportunity to discuss encounters with theory, people were moving quite quickly away from initially being, I suppose, trite, towards describing and engaging with theory in some very problematic and engaging ways. So theory and TEL is lively, it is problematic, and to me that's a really good position for us to be in. It's much better than the pretense of managerial consensus, and there's a lot to look forward to, probably with more interventionist modes as we look forward, but those interventions will now feel perhaps much better informed for this piece. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm glad I'm after you, Phil, because I think that there's a nice segue into the work that I've been doing. I teach and convene on a blended learning design module on the University of Nottingham's postgraduate certificate in higher education course. And this article that I've written, I'm really motivated to develop a richer picture of what sort of TEL theory and conceptual frameworks and the literature that the participants on the course engage with, and how it informs not only for their assessments they do as part of the PGCHE, but actually their design thinking and blended learning and using technology in the classroom. This paper, I have deliberately used the word wading out of murky waters, because I think for a lot of new to teaching as well as new to theoretical concepts, it is a bit like wading, and one of my academics actually used that thing about wading in murky waters. So it's part of a larger research project. I've started doing some interviews with academics, but this paper is analysing just literally what they've been using. I'm interested in, are there any different disciplinary differences in the way that these teachers are engaging with the literature? What are the variances and similarities? Do particular disciplines find TEL literature and theoretical concepts challenging to engage with? And if so, well, then how do they engage with, and what's the decision making when using literature, and how does the theory inform their practice? The things that I'm interested in around sort of where this might move, and I think this whole, I just have to say, this whole special issue is going to be so amazing for so many different people, because it's putting it all out there, with me struggling with working with academics who may not at first be interested in literature, and struggling about, you know, it's just about my class and what do I do, and, you know, dealing with all the different challenges of being a new academic. But do we write inclusively? And by that, I'm talking about, do we sort of see the perspective from the different disciplines when they're reading work, and does things inadvertently push them away or engage them with the literature? And also about the forms that we publish in, and I'm quite interested in looking at podcasting as well as journal articles, blogs, you know, conference papers, and is there other ways that we might be able to engage with a more diverse audience? I've got this little quote just to finish off my little spiel here. Was I got a lovely email from one of my veterinary science academics who's just literally finished the PGCHE as of this week. We had our exam board. She said, "You've got me hooked on education research, and I'd love the next step for me to be a PhD in education, either digital strategies or workplace-based medical teaching. So I hope to see you in the future." So I just thought that's a nice little ending to my talk, and thank you.
Okay, hi everyone, it's me again. Maria was worried about her bandwidth, so she is actually present, but Maria's asked me to use a short video which she's kindly sent to me in the background. So I'm going to, like I did for the earlier one, I'm going to attempt to share that again.
So my paper on educational theory in TEL, where I propose a simulation-based learning model for teaching higher education, I aim to join the novelty and engagement debate, and I wanted to give the message that the learning process depends mostly on the environment rather than the technology itself and the novelty it offers. So the paper is about creating and integrating activities that enable the development of human factors. For example, leadership, collaboration, and reflection. So we needed a theoretical framework in order to achieve that in practice. Therefore, I take ideas from situated learning, PBL, and experiential learning, create a framework and position notions of technology-enhanced learning in order to give a clear indication of what students could do with the technology instead of what the technology does for them. And most importantly, how this relates to the broader educational context, and not just the classroom environment, but things like work practices outside the university. So this could serve as a basis as to how to build environments for developing leadership skills, reflection, and collaborative practices through the uses of simulations.
Okay, with a bit of luck, you're now seeing my slide and me again. So we're now at the stage where we've had a chock-full seminar about a chock-full issue, and I'll just offer a few closing comments, which don't worry, I will keep brief. I think it's interesting that in the commentaries we already have in the present issue, we can already see, I think, the emergence of the kind of conversation that we want to facilitate on an ongoing basis. So the issue as a whole demonstrates that conversation, but the commentaries show that it can move over time. So there's certainly in the commentaries that exist a lot of talk about how the papers have helped them to think, including about how it helps them to think that they're not such bad people if they feel uncertain, that actually being uncertain about theory and not having to grasp for something huge and intimidating is actually an okay place to be. And there's also been a lot of talk about how reading other people's papers has helped you reflect on your own work. This is the kind of thing that people in the commentaries were saying. And I think that's entirely the kind of thing that we want to start to nurture. So the next steps for the journal, we believe that the concepts we have are reasonable. They're not set in stone. Over time, they're likely to change and develop and become more concrete, of course. But we think that they're a reasonable starting point. So we want to try and see how those concepts can be made concrete over the coming period. And the most immediate thing is that we have a schedule, an itinerary of upcoming future special issues. You can see 5 such special issues on the screen, starting with visual representations and inclusion, which should be coming along in about 2 months from now. Technology enhanced learning in the Middle East, where we have about 20 people writing the papers, autoethnography, activity theory, and inclusivity. It's interesting, we did actually have 2 papers on activity theory in this first issue, and of the 11 papers, we've covered 9 of them, and it's the 2 activity theory papers that were not covered, but don't worry, there'll be plenty of time to hear more about activity theory in the future. We're inviting ongoing commentaries on the papers we're already publishing. We're still considering the best ways to curate those, but nonetheless, whether they appear in sections within each issue or whether we have specific issues of the journal each year where we devote to commentaries or extensions of previous issues, it's part of the conversation, actually. We want to broaden the network of people involved in the journal. It's actually perfectly legitimate from our perspective that many of the people involved in the journal have emerged from the networks around the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning and the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster. That's a natural and entirely legitimate thing, But in launching the journal, we've already started to reach people that we wouldn't have come across perhaps otherwise, including very internationally. And the website for the journal itself, which has you know, the usual tracking mechanisms in the background, says that we're getting about 100 to 150 unique visitors each day, which we think is a rather good thing for a fairly new and nascent project. So if you want to be one of those visitors and you haven't been already, then the website is, the URL is listed at the bottom, stel.pubpub.org. It's also linked from the centre pages on the departmental website. And I'd like to say thank you to all of those who've participated, including in conceiving the journal. This had a long gestation period, as I said at the outset, which is described to some extent in one of the editorials. To those who contributed papers and peer reviews, and also to those who were involved in the work of getting the journal actually to exist, including people from the Knowledge Foundation, and to one of the authors, Seba Al-Ali, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, but who volunteered, perhaps not knowing what she was getting herself in for, to put some voluntary work into the journal, and then ended up doing a lot of things behind the scenes, and we thank her very much. So thank you. That's all from me.
Okay, thanks, Brett. If you could stop sharing your screen, maybe.
Yeah.
Thanks. So we've got a little bit of time, 3 minutes for some questions. And I think Zayed had a question for Brett. So Zayed, could I ask you to ask your question? Well, maybe I'll ask it for Zayed then, seeing that doesn't seem to be working. Zayed was asking about the kind of, in the chat, Brett, about the difference between exceptionalism and the conceptualizing. Yeah, how, you know, whether actually exceptionalism was a form of conceptualization in itself. And I just wondered, cold, without knowing I was going to ask you that, whether you had any immediate thoughts on that.
It's actually an interesting point. I mean, I hadn't thought of it quite in that way, but the answer is probably yes. What we do see in the work that I was reviewing already is a set of debates opening up about whether theory has different roles in a particular research project and in a research agenda that extends over some time. And it seems to me fairly clear that the answer is yes, we just haven't reflected enough on that. And I think what the question relates to is, does it also have some influence? Do we want to theorize on the development of the field overall and its relationships? And I would say the answer is yes, but once again, we haven't thought enough about that. It seems that there's a lot of talk in the literature about what kind of power, actually, when you start to think about research agendas, and I guess this will extend to the field, there's a lot of interest in what kind of power that certain theories have. That people talk about analytical power and rhetorical power, you know, the power to persuade, the power to capture agendas, the power to be convincing, and so forth. And I think that that's a very interesting thing to think about, the power of theory to influence the direction of the field and how it interacts with its external stakeholders. So I think there is an interesting conversation to be had there, but it's a good question. And partly the reason it's a good question is I don't, of course, have a very complete picture of where that might go.
Great. Thanks, Brett. And I think that kind of brings us to the end of the time for this seminar. So, you know, and that's a great place to end, because in terms of the power of theory to shape the field, that also leaves us with the question of what power will this journal have to shape the field? And I think, you know, the signs initially are really good. My sense is that this is a kind of really important act of community building. You know, actually what the journal can offer is helping to develop a critically integrated, self-aware and connected community that has these conversations, and that's incredibly exciting. So to close, I would like to thank Meg, Don, James, Sejin, Phil, Denise, Maria, and especially Brett and Kyungmee for giving this seminar and for their important contributions to the journal. It's a really exciting development, and well done to everyone. The chat on the chat in the chat, as it were, has been really engaging, dynamic as well. And yeah, and clearly you can continue those conversations by reading the journals, connecting on Twitter to the various people concerned, and also emailing them. And then finally, our next online seminar will be on Wednesday, the 25th of November, 2020. And in a way it's connected to this one. It will be by Ben Williamson from University of Edinburgh. And the title is Pandemic Privatisation Through Online Learning Platforms. I think I just described this as a potentially disturbing seminar as we look at the way in which the pandemic has led to the privatisation of learning platforms. And in response on Twitter, Ben said to me that he'd also be looking to bring some more kind of inspiring and heartening examples to his talk too. So please join us for that. Thank you for joining us for this seminar. I think it's been a really engaging occasion, and take care, everyone. Thank you.